You're listening to On Shifting Ground. I'm Ray Suarez. The 25th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement was a moment for reflection of just how far Northern Ireland had come since the days of the Troubles. But in the months since, new policy from the United Kingdom looks like it might threaten the historic peace. The Northern Ireland Troubles Legacy and Reconciliation Act, passed in September, offers amnesty to the perpetrators of crimes and violence who cooperate with a new reconciliation commission. And the law has inflamed tensions in Northern Ireland, prompting a call from the European Union to repeal it. It's just the latest wrinkle in the ongoing Brexit saga, and joining me to explain the consequences of the controversial law is Jude Webber. She's Ireland correspondent for the Financial Times, covering all developments in the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland. Welcome to On Shifting Ground.
Thanks very much for the invitation.
Was the recent 25th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement, let's say, a more ambivalent commemoration than Northern Ireland experienced on the, let's say, 10th anniversary or 20th?
Well, I wasn't in Northern Ireland on the 10th or the 20th anniversary, but I mean, the 25th anniversary, it's a big number, quarter of a century. So much was supposed to have happened, so much has happened. And so it was billed as a very, very big celebration. But obviously, as on the 20th anniversary, it was overshadowed by the fact that one of the central things that the Good Friday Agreement created, which was the political structure for Northern Ireland, the power-sharing executive, that's on hold, and it's been on hold now for 18 months, essentially. So there was a very big celebration. Bill Clinton came to town, George Mitchell came to town, Tony Blair came to town. The whole thing happened. Everybody was extolling the praises of what an important deal it was, but one of the key sort of pillars of this deal isn't actually functioning.
When you say isn't functioning or on hold, I mean, the Good Friday Agreement created structures. It created a way of governing Northern Ireland. Who's running the place now?
Civil servants are running the place. Civil servants and London to some extent. So the executive can't function unless the two big parties both agree. And at the moment, the DUP, which is the biggest pro-UK party, the Democratic Unionist Party, is embroiled in a big row over how Brexit trading arrangements should function for Northern Ireland. And so they say they won't return to the executive until those things are sorted out. And their ability to trade with Britain and the Unionists' right to their identity as part of the United Kingdom is fully supported. So this has meant that the government hasn't been able to function. And for balance, this is something that on the other side of the aisle, Sinn Féin has done as well in the past. In 2017 until 2020, Sinn Féin refused to enter government. And so the executive was on hold at that time as well. So what that has meant is that civil servants are in charge. They're doing the day-to-day, and a budget has been set by London, by the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland. And the problem with this time is that very, very deep and serious cuts to the budget are required because there's a massive overspend. And so instead of political representatives making those very, very sensitive and difficult cuts, it's fallen to civil servants to do it. So it's absolutely not ideal.
The interesting thing with all this passage of time is that a lot of the stars, let's say, the best-known names from those 90s compacts, have left the stage or are not actively involved in the day-to-day. And during those first heady days, Northern Ireland's first year of peace after the Troubles ended and so on, people who hated each other, who had spent much of their adult lives in a kind of low-grade civil war with each other, were working together in a government. And the people we're talking about now are in their 30s and 40s. They aren't even children of the bloodletting in the same way as many others were. And you think, well, God, if those guys could work together, why can't these people?
No, absolutely. And I think that's one of the things that people say quite regularly. Times have changed. The Troubles as something that happened is not seen as so relevant to some young people for their lived experience, and they're more concerned with jobs, housing, all of these other sort of crises. Northern Ireland has long had a situation where a lot of young people go abroad to study and then just never come back because they haven't felt that they've had the opportunities or there hasn't been sort of the prospect. So the British government, at least, and the Irish government say that the Windsor framework, which is this revised Brexit trade arrangements for Northern Ireland that leaves, basically Brexit left Northern Ireland with one foot in the EU's single market and one foot, well, obviously still remaining within the UK single market. So it has a unique ability to trade in both directions. And so this is being billed and bigged up as something very unique access that will create jobs and growth and development and all the rest of it. And so young people, they're trying to appeal to those rather than the sort of backward-looking politics of the past. But you're dead right. I mean, times have changed. And obviously, I think it's very easy now to talk about the failings of the Good Friday Agreement, you know, its inability to deliver a solid political structure. But it hasn't collapsed altogether, and there is still far more peace than there was before. There are obviously outbreaks of violence and worrying situations, but it is really a whole new ball game to where things were before.
When I first started covering Ireland in the 80s, it was considered backward and poor, and the hold-up to any future unification was that Northern Ireland couldn't take on a place that had a religious-based constitution, had structural economic problems, that had very little future, it was described to me in Belfast. And the border was like it was like more like the Berlin Wall than an imaginary line. But when I was in Ireland, maybe the Good Friday Agreement had been in place, 5 or 6 years, people routinely went back and forth. They knew people on the other side. It felt like something new was afoot, even if there wasn't a permanent, durable formula for moving ahead. It felt like things were in motion in ways large and small. And now with Brexit, and Brexit gets mentioned prominently whenever this story gets told, it seems like the border's real again after becoming more of a detail.
It's interesting because the border is real again after becoming more of a detail, but there's also a discussion about the future status of Northern Ireland that there hasn't been, at a level that there hasn't been before. People talk about a new Ireland, or obviously Sinn Féin, the nationalist party that's the biggest party on both sides of the border. They openly talk about driving towards a reunification referendum. There have been a spate of books, there's been a lot of talk, but people, even young people, are actually now starting to question, because of the problems that Brexit has thrown up and the fact that, for example, in Northern Ireland, as we've said, they don't have a government at the moment, and it's a very stop-start politics, and they're not sure how that will be fixed. They're starting to think, they're starting to discuss whether or not they could or would support any other kind of constitutional settlement on the island. I was quite surprised the other day. I was at an event and there were some young loyalists, so very pro-UK young people from a background that would be traditionally very opposed to any kind of reunification or greater integration. And, one of them said that it's something that comes up sometimes and they're not necessarily completely closed to the idea. But obviously, as you said, Ireland in the past was a backwater, a rural, church-dominated country, and now it's a country that has money flooding in from the corporate tax receipts of the big tech and the big pharma companies that are based in Ireland. It's much richer than the north, but it's still an interesting question, because polls show that people in the north, a majority of people don't want reunification at this point. In the south, a majority do want it. But then if you ask more questions like, well, would you be prepared to pay more tax to fund it? Or would you be prepared to change the flag? People then answer, oh, no, thank you. So the conversation's a long way off, but there's a real sense that there is a debate and there is an evolution. And that comes, as you say, at a time when the border suddenly is looming much larger than it ever did before.
This conversation, quiet, unofficial, but ongoing, did it get messed up by the Taoiseach, Leo Varadkar, the Prime Minister, actually saying out loud that he could imagine reunification in his lifetime? Now, he's a young fella, as politicians go, but still, it seemed a pretty audacious thing to say right now.
Well, yes, what you feel about that kind of says a lot about where you stand politically. So Britain says it's very unhelpful for him to say things like that, while at the same time saying things like Northern Ireland's part of the Union, which nationalists or Republicans take exception to sometimes by saying, well, they can say that and defend that, but we can't defend our point of view. So it's throwing the cat among the pigeons a little bit. I think it's interesting because it's gone further than Irish politicians have been prepared to in the past. Both Fianna Fáil and Varadkar's Fine Gael party are parties that espouse a united Ireland. But in the past, they've been a little bit ticklish about actually saying, and I expect to see one. It's certainly something that nationalists think, well, that's the direction of travel. Unionists are, on the whole, getting older and their support is declining, and there are fewer Protestants now than there are Catholics for the first time in Northern Ireland. So demographics would suggest that they're on a downward trajectory, because what we've seen in Northern Ireland is not only Sinn Féin, the Nationalist Party, is now the biggest party, but we've also seen the rise of the Alliance Party, which doesn't identify itself in this traditional green nationalist, orange, unionist sort of binary way that has traditionally defined Northern Ireland politics. So you've got the rise of these people, and some young people in particular, but some Alliance supporters are very agnostic on the question of Irish reunification or any of these sort of constitutional questions. They just want things to work and they don't really care. And it's similar to whether you ask politicians or people in Northern Ireland, how do you identify yourself? Are you Irish? Are you Northern Irish? Are you British? But it's also interesting, for example, the Rugby World Cup's on at the moment. Ireland is an all-Ireland team. There are players from Northern Ireland who play alongside. The majority of players are from the south, but there are players from the north. They play in green, and northern politicians, such as the leader of the Democratic Unionist Party, the biggest pro-UK party, and the one that's stopping the government from working at the moment, tweeting out his support and saying how great it is. So there is complicated, this sort of question of identity, and it's shifting.
One big thing, or let's say another big thing, because we're talking about a landscape that's littered with big things, is a new law meant to get to the bottom of the many unsolved crimes of the era of the Troubles. What's in the law? Who supports it? And critically, who doesn't?
Well, we'll start with the last point first. No one supports it really except the British government. Victims groups, rights groups are up in arms. They are appalled at the prospect for two reasons. The law essentially does two things. One, it shuts down inquests and civil cases from next May. So if you think back to the inquiry into Bloody Sunday, or the inquest into the Ballymurphy massacre. These are things that we've seen in recent years. The Ballymurphy inquest was only a couple of years ago. That would not be possible under this new law. And the other thing that it does is it sets up an independent commission for information recovery and reconciliation, and they will be in charge of investigations, but they won't be criminal investigations, so they won't have the power to put people in prison. And so it essentially offers an amnesty for anybody who cooperates with the process of information gathering, and it's a sort of a conflict resolution mechanism if you want, but it offers this amnesty. So the two really critical parts are the end to inquests and civil cases and amnesty. And all political parties in Northern Ireland and the Irish government think it's terrible, and the Irish government is considering legal action against London, which diplomatically will be very strained, because they say that there was an agreement a few years ago called the Stormont House Agreement, and everybody came onto the same page about how to deal with the past, and now Britain is going it alone with this unilateral approach, and that they haven't listened, they haven't taken on board enough of the criticisms. On the flip side, what London says is, we listened, we made amendments, this is as good as it's going to get, guys, because 25 years have passed since the end of the Troubles, many more years have passed since some of the earlier crimes in the 70s. It's getting very difficult to secure prosecutions, and that if you can't get that, maybe this will give some comfort and some information to families that they wouldn't otherwise have got. I think it's very, very difficult, but I think what sticks in the throat of some of the victims' families and some of the rights groups is London telling them, what to do, them saying, well, you won't get better than this, and so this is the best way to go, and we've decided that for you, and they feel that they weren't included and they aren't being listened to. So it's an interesting body. It's being headed up by a former Chief Justice, and the head of investigations is a man who has a very distinguished career in peace building. He's the head of an NGO, and previously he was the most senior Catholic police officer in the Northern Ireland Police. He has a very good track record. So the fact that these two very respected individuals are willing to work with this process, I think is interesting. But there are already, I think, probably 16 cases have been brought in Belfast already, and it's only been on the statute books a week. And Ireland is deciding what to do, whether or not to take a case to the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg. So there's a long legal road ahead.
You had a long career as a reporter in Latin America, including in many societies under a new political order trying to reconcile itself to crimes of the past. And they struggled too. Do you feel emanations, parallels from places like Chile, from Argentina, from Paraguay in this latest attempt to try to close the files on the Troubles?
Not directly, I think, because I think the different thing in this case is that we're talking about a sort of a former power. Britain used to be in charge of the whole of Ireland, now is only in charge of the northern part of Ireland. So diplomatically, Britain and Ireland are supposed to be partners in safeguarding and upholding and guaranteeing the Good Friday Agreement. And so I think Dublin takes exception to the idea that we're supposed to be working on these things together. How dare you go and do this on your own? I don't think that's necessarily the case in other countries, because it's been obviously a newer administration looking back at an administration that was perhaps dictatorial, or you've got a sort of democracy versus dictatorship divide. That's not the same here. It's more diplomatically nuanced. It's difficult here. It's clearly very difficult, and there's no easy answer. And some people won't get the answers or wouldn't get the answers even if inquests were allowed to continue and there was no sense of amnesty. I think the problem that some of the families and the victims groups bring up is they feel that this is really tailored towards protecting British soldiers from any kind of prosecution for their part in atrocities committed in Northern Ireland. People from some of the paramilitary groups aren't going to want to cooperate with this body, and therefore if they don't cooperate, it all hinges on a sort of voluntary cooperation. If they don't cooperate, then the whole thing falls apart. So I think the feeling is very much that it's one-sided.
In South Africa, where they tried a similar thing, there was a little bit of relief among some victims, and certainly among perpetrators who felt that they were ordered or forced to do things they might not otherwise do. But it also brought a kind of sunlight to crimes committed 30 and 40 years earlier. It sounds from what's coming out of Northern Ireland now that closing the books is not necessarily wanted for its own sake, let's say, that it wouldn't end anything. It would just begin a kind of new argument.
That's a very fair point. Because Northern Ireland, it's still an incredibly divided society. You still have a very segregated education system. Even in some parts of the city, bus stops are used by people from one community and other bus stops are used by people from another community. So it's very deeply divided still, even though a lot of progress has been made since the Good Friday Agreement.
I wonder if part of the difficulty that I'm hearing you describe is that recent developments have stripped away the ability to just sort of quietly live with the ambiguity, that it just laid bare stuff that people were sort of getting on with it. But this was a small island with a small population, with two currencies, two political orders, two political allegiances, and now Brexit has brought into high relief what was just sort of bubbling on when both countries were still in the EU. You can't hide anymore the the crazy Rube Goldberg machine that's been created for trade flows, for customs union, for ships that are leaving and sailing past Great Britain to get to France and Holland. This has just created more difficulty than the quiet wink and sort of observing the ambiguity was able to stand any longer.
It's interesting because, just in the question of not having a government, for example, I'm reminded very much of when I left Argentina in 2013. Inflation was 25% and everything was going up, and I was finding it's like 25%, that's really tough. And my salary wasn't going up by 25%, so in the end I moved. And I remember talking then and since to Argentine friends who said, oh no, this is nothing. We've seen it all. Hyperinflation was so terrible. And I'm often reminded with that sort of same sense of acceptance in Northern Ireland. Since the Good Friday Agreement in 1998, 40% of the time they haven't had a government, and it's almost like they don't really expect one. It's almost like sometimes they don't expect things. So they are used to getting on without it. So I sort of feel like there's been a massive acceptance of the dysfunction of the place. But now that's being challenged by the very fact that all things seem to be falling apart at the same time.
I wonder if the variable, let's say, of violence, it kind of concentrated the mind. When I interviewed Jerry Adams, George Mitchell, the Northern Ireland Secretary of the time, Mo Mowlam, the fact that terrible things could happen if we don't fix this was always in the back of people's minds. And now it is not as present. Yes, it's still there, and people still talk about it, and people are very aware of its possibility, but it really, Oma, Inniskillen, the memory, the conscious memory of these terrible atrocities was real. And it gave people this sense, well, we've got to fix this, we've got to get this right, or else this situation is unthinkable. And for all the problems, I don't see people talking about those kinds of things as a real possibility. A bomb going off in a market street tomorrow. It's not the pressure in the pipe that it used to be. Is that fair?
Absolutely fair. No one is talking about a return to violence. There are handfuls of violent actors still on the stage, if you like, and that's why there was a big data breach in August where personal information identifying all of the approximately 10,000 serving police officers and civilian staff in the police service of Northern Ireland was put up on the internet, on the public internet, for a few hours. And this fell into the hands of dissident Republican groups who opposed the peace process. And that's incredibly serious for a police force that still is being targeted, but absolutely not on the scale that it was during the Troubles. I think nobody would say we should be complacent about that. Obviously, it's still a far from ideal situation. But yes, things have changed, and that is one of the very, very tangible ways that things have moved forwards. But I think the interesting thing about the Good Friday Agreement, to come back to where we started, was Tony Blair, the British Prime Minister at that time, was really prepared to do something to fix this, to get sort of political momentum and to try and once and for all build on a growing peace process and bring it over the line. At the moment, you don't sort of get the sense that Northern Ireland, probably because, as you say, it's been at peace a relative peace for so much longer now, it's not the same political priority that it once was.
Jude Webber, it sounds like as long as this is your beat, you'll never be wanting for work.
It does, doesn't it?
Thanks for joining us.
It's a pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.
You've been listening to On Shifting Ground, produced in partnership with KQED, with funding from listeners like you. Today's episode was mixed and mastered by Matteo Schimpf. Additional production and engineering were provided by Rob Spate. KQED's Jim Bennett is our technical supervisor. Jared Sport is our executive producer. Philip Yunn is CEO of World Affairs. Our music is from Blue Dot Sessions. I'm Ray Suarez. Thanks for listening.